Warships, fighter jets, rising tensions. The fight over Iran's nuclear program is entering a new and dangerous phase. Negotiators are still talking, but on the ground, the confrontation is escalating on both sides. There's saber-rattling between the United States and Iran. Iran's Revolutionary Guard is flexing its muscles in the Strait of Hormuz, calling it just a naval exercise. Meanwhile, a U.S. aircraft carrier is already in the region, and a second one has now been deployed to the Middle East. Inside Iran, the regime is fueling anti-American rhetoric. And when Iranians protest, the authorities crack down brutally, as we saw again in early January. Iranian exile communities around the world are rallying against the regime's violence. And in the U.S., the president is openly calling for political change in Tehran. All this while both sides say they still want to negotiate a nuclear deal. And to the point we ask, U.S. military pressure on Iran. Is a regime change the real goal? I'm Javier Arguedas. It's good to have you with us. Let's meet today's guests. Hans-Jakob Schindler is a terrorism expert and director of the Counter-Extremism Project. Daniel Gerlach is an author, commentator, and leading expert in the Middle East and the wider Muslim world. He's also the editor-in-chief of Zenith magazine. And Mahtab Ghwalizadeh is an Iranian journalist specializing in macroeconomics, political economy, and women's rights. To all of you, welcome and thank you for being with us today. Mahtab, I'd like to start with you. The world saw those massive protests in Iran and the brutal repression that followed. It seems like political turmoil is not in the international headlines at the moment anymore. What do you hear from back home?
Honestly, 40,000 people were killed in Iran. And each family, directly or indirectly, are sorrow, are mourning. And as someone who experienced at least 4 major protests in Iran, I know after a huge crackdown, the society goes in deep disappointed and fall down. But in this time, one thing was very different, is very different. Citizens and the society has a big new hope. They hope by a strike by the United States or military strike, because during the years, people find that they have no guns, no weapons, no oil, and they cannot stay in front of the government with their hand. So they find that they need abroad help, a military maybe. It should be led to goes the Islamic Republic down, and so this time it was a bit difference between other protests.
Yeah. However, the regime seems to think, Daniel, that the correct strategy is to completely crack down on these protests. Do you think that works? Do you think that fear has taken over?
No, it's a strategy of burning bridges. And I think also for the regime, it's become more and more clear that there is no way back. What happened last January was a magnitude of bloodshed that no one can ignore. And you see, even though at the moment there's no protest going on, these days mark not only the beginning of the holy month of Ramadan, but also the 40 days of mourning. So usually in the Middle East, but particularly in the Shia tradition, the 40 days after the death, the demise of a person, then you commemorate that person again. And the regime was extremely nervous that these days would spark again protests. So you heard implicit statements from, let's say, government officials or officials in general, who even admitted that during the crackdowns of the protests, people had been killed with gunshots in their heads. For example, the director of one of the largest cemeteries in Tehran, who is after all an official, he admitted that. So of course, you have the regime narrative that this was all incited by terrorists and by foreign agents, the usual stories that we hear now. We hear forced confessions. We have the revolutionary court system in place that wants to demonstrate to its own followers that they have the situation under control. But you can see that the regime and the regime officials are extremely nervous when it comes to the social situation. People are extremely traumatized. They are, I think it's also understandable that at the moment nobody dares to go out on the streets at night. But for many, this is just another wave. And we've seen it in the last couple of years that every time there is a new protest wave, it has a bigger impact, and there's more and more people, and the crackdown is more violent. And then in the end, you can ask, like, how long is the regime willing to apply that strategy?
There is one significant factor that we also have to mention in this particular context, Hans, and that is the President of the United States, who has openly expressed a desire of a regime change in Iran. We all saw what happened in Venezuela. Do you think that these warships are setting the conditions for a possible strike by the U.S. against Iran?
Well, I mean, the warship sets the conditions for a military pressure on the regime to compromise. So what is here discussed is that there are two different agreements that are supposed to be reached. The Iranian side wants to reach an agreement on the nuclear dossier only, and the US side so far says it has to be the nuclear issue, it has to be the ballistic missiles, and it has to be the relationship with your proxies. Now, the problem I see is that the tactic of the Iranian side is simply to string out these negotiations as long as possible. They've now had negotiations about the principles of the negotiations, although it's the same set of individuals that met last time for 5 times in summer 2025. So what principles are we actually talking about? If that hadn't been agreed in 5 meetings in 2025, I don't know what principles are supposed to be agreed. The real risk here from Iranian domestic perspective is that the difference between Women, Life, Freedom in 2022 and this time was that A, it is not about social or political issues. It started on pure economic issues, loss of control over inflation and your currency. That is something the regime cannot solve on its own unless it gets a cash infusion from the outside, which means the usual tactic. You repress with violence, increasing violence every time, but you repress the demonstrations, and then you take half a step back. For example, in 2022, you increase the punishment for violations of the hijab law, but you cease controlling of the hijab law in all of the major cities. Is not working now, because there's simply no cash left, unless they get cash from the outside.
For that, they actually also may need that compromise and may need a nuclear deal. But for Donald Trump, past nuclear talks with Iran went nowhere. He wants a far more comprehensive deal, and he's ready to ramp up pressure on Iran's clerical regime to the maximum, even hinting he'd be willing to use military force if necessary.
The U.S. is determined. Its President Donald Trump wants regime change in Iran, and the use of military force is not off the table.
Well, it seems like that would be the best thing that could happen. For 47 years, they've been talking and talking and talking. In the meantime, we've lost a lot of lives while they talk.
But the regime in Tehran is also flexing its muscles, staging a naval maneuver in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important oil trade routes, and threatening to close it. And it appears Tehran is rebuilding missile positions targeted by last summer's U.S. military strikes, targeting Iran's military and nuclear program. The words used by the country's leader are defiant. Americans should know that if they start a war, this time it will be a regional war. This open threat is also directed at Israel, Iran's other arch-enemy. Prime Minister Netanyahu insists that Iran must not be allowed to possess enriched uranium. Just how likely is an open confrontation with Iran?
So, we just heard from Hans what the U.S. is actually pursuing in these negotiations with Iran. Regime change is not officially part of those intentions. Do you think that the actions we're seeing by the U.S. right now go in that direction, or that it's really just about the nuclear deal the military power and ballistic missiles and the proxy wars?
Neither nor. There's a lot of Trump astrology going on. People trying to analyze what does he want, what is his ultimate goal. I think it's important to rationalize his behavior, but at the same time not to believe that there is a grand strategy behind this. One day he says he wants to have a regime change would be the best thing. There's a lot of people in Washington who think that this is a historic moment to do it. After all, his chief negotiators, Jared Kushner and Witkoff, they have substantial business interest in the Gulf region and the Gulf allies in particular. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, maybe also the UAE, Kuwait, all these countries just want nothing less than a war because it's going to ruin their business model severely, and they also believe that this war would take a long time. Now, when Donald Trump said a few weeks ago, when the crackdown happened, we are locked and loaded, that was actually not the case. Back then, the Americans had a few warships in the region. They could have launched probably 60 cruise missiles against Iranian targets, and then what? So the Americans needed to assess the damage and the potential damage, and they knew that when Ayatollah Khamenei says that this is going to be a regional war, that he means what he says. It would have meant striking not only military U.S. targets in Azerbaijan, Turkey, and across the Gulf region, but also civilian, including embassies, oil companies, and so on. So in order to make his threat credible, Trump needed to bring in more forces in order to be able to continue this war and not be left, with empty ships that have no weapons after they have launched their cruise missiles. Yeah. So they're bringing in these aircraft carriers, 2 or probably even 3, and this means that now they have the technical means for an extended military operation or war. Okay. But the question again is they can strike state institutions, they can strike the Revolutionary Guard, they can strike the missile system or the nuclear program. But I do not see a strategy yet how this would lead directly to a regime change. All
right, that's of course one of the big questions. The other one is how big the threat of the Iranian nuclear program is, Hans. We know that the US bombed Iran last June in order to strike the nuclear capacities, the nuclear sites. What do we know about the current situation of the nuclear capacity of Iran and how dangerous it really is?
Well, I mean, practically nothing. Right? The price for the military strike always was, and as predicted happened, is that, of course, the IAEA is no longer allowed in the country. The inspectors are not allowed to inspect the installations. Now, the delegation a couple of days ago in Geneva that met with the Americans brought some technical experts to talk with the IAEA as a carrot in front of the nose of the international community. But of course, those talks ended inconclusively. So, of course, there is going to be some intelligence information about the program, but it's not the systematic checking of the program that we had until the 12th Day War with these agreed inspections of the IAEA. As badly and as maybe spot-like they were a basis of information that everyone could build on, and then you had to focus on the aspects as a government that were not inspectable by the IAEA. So now it's all intelligence information, which is not always 100% reliable. So we just don't know, but we do know that the knowledge that existed before the 12th Day War did not cease to exist in Iran after the 12th Day War, and that it's clear that the regime will attempt or is attempting to rebuild aspects of that program.
Now, Mehtab, when you hear about the intention to negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran, how do you think that deal could look like, considering that Iran had already signed a nuclear deal in the past and that the last time it was negotiating with the U.S. bombed Iran basically during the negotiations?
You know what? I feel, or I guess, if the Islamic Republic is saying true and they want peaceful nuclear energy, they doesn't need enrichment uranium inside Iran, and the United States knows this fact. So, and we saw in Venezuela case, the United States is serious in their policies. So I feel this is not a real negotiation. This is what the United States say, and the Islamic Republic have to accept all of them. And it's not their policy. they're not accept all of them, because they know if they accept all the points, they have to go fall down. So there is not any negotiation. I guess the United States strike is will be done. I mean,
it's imminent. You don't think there's any other alternative. Would you agree, Daniel, that that is the only possible outcome?
No, I don't agree that this is the only possible outcome. There's too much at stake for the Americans. I don't exclude that option. I think Trump has shown in the past that he acted against his advisors. He gambled on Iran a couple of times. We had it in 2020 with the assassination of Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad. We had it also with the various examples last year in June that the Americans did go from deterrence to action. So Iran is perceived as a threat by America, for American interest in the region. But there's also a certain obsessive relationship with Iran and a certain fear on the American side, a trauma. We had it in 1980 that an American president lost his re-election, Jimmy Carter, because of the plight of an adventure of a hostage liberation in Iran. That is something the Americans have seen whenever they got involved in Iranian affairs. They're taking a lot of risks. And the Iranian regime is gambling on that. They're capitalizing on this. They're increasing their threat. And I think Iran is in the Iranian regime is in its weakest position ever since probably the mid-80s. Yes. But being cornered for them also means to, take no prisoners, literally, and to fire out whatever they have. So this regime is struggling for its survival. So I think it is also important, though many people think it's not a credible option, to explore the political path and to apply not only military but also political pressure.
Let's have a look at what scenarios are at stake, because as we just mentioned, there is no certainty that if there is a political or a military attack by the United States that would lead to a regime change, nor what would happen next. Let's have a look at some possible outcomes for what's next for Iran.
If the current regime collapses, the Revolutionary Guards could take over. The security force of the mullahs would then become the country's military rulers. Scenario 2. Opposition figures in exile could assume power, at least temporarily. One name mentioned repeatedly is Reza Pahlavi, the son of the last Shah. He has lived in American exile for decades, but is a controversial figure. His portrait appears again and again at demonstrations against the mullah regime, both in Washington and in Munich, where tens of thousands took to the streets over the weekend. Many want Pahlavi to lead the country, at least a transitional government. He portrays himself as modest.
My sole aim was to see the day where the Iranian people will finally be able to elect their future democratic government. The day that happens, I consider that the end of my political mission in life.
But some attending the march in Munich were critical of the Shah's son. We don't want to replace one dictatorship with another. If the mullah regime really does fall, what would come next for Iran?
So we were talking about the current state of the regime in Iran. We know that it's as weak as ever, as we just heard, Hans, but do you think that its days are counted?
It is really difficult to predict because, of course, everything that the regime had built up in the last 30 years, really over the last 2 years, where the region was neither plagued by overt stability, nor was it the case that it was anyone else but the Iranian regime that was part of the driver of that instability. It was Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, all are financed by the Iranian regime. So when Khamenei says the threat of a nuclear war, I'm wondering, where have you been the last 2 years? There has been a regional war going on in the region already. So, what exactly is the threat here? That is all true. However, it is also true that all means of power inside Iran are on the side of the regime at this point. All the weapons, police, intelligence, the judiciary is on the side of the regime, and the protesters have nothing but their bodies and lives to set against that regime. So the balance is not equal. And an organizational element is missing within the opposition. Now, Reza Pahlavi is a very controversial figure, but he's become somewhat of an identification point for that movement on the outside. The lady in the demonstration represents a tiny part of the Iranian opposition. It's the Mujahideen Khalq. And if she would have been honest, she would have said, we don't want to replace their dictatorship with his dictatorship, but with our dictatorship. Because the Mujahideen Khalq are a personality cult in a Stalinistic fashion around the family, and Mariam Rajavi. And they would not be presenting a democratic model. By the way, that was a tiny demonstration compared to 250,000 people that were in Munich at that time. So she does not represent a particular viable option or even a particular large option of the opposition. So unless the opposition gets organized, unless there is a way to disrupt the internal stability of the power brokers within the regime, i.e. dissent within the Pasdaran or between the Pasdaran, the Revolutionary Guards, and other parts of the regime, this is not going to work as far as the stabilization of the regimes. Dictatorships are not popularity contests. It's really a question of who has the power and who doesn't.
So we just heard that the power is not inside of Iran to fight off the regime, but there is a lot of pressure outside. What do you make, Mahtab, about the figure of Pahlavi and how much he has mobilized the international Iranian scene, if you will, in the last few days?
In my point of view, we have to concentrate on and focus on what people say inside Iran. And the message of inside Iran was really clear. Many people, thousands or millions of people walk on the street and say two things. They don't want the Islamic Republic and they want the Pahlavi return Iran. So any other words is not work on Iran, you know, because the opposition inside Iran wants Pahlavi. We have to consider this point. They don't talk about the model of regime. They don't talk about republic or monetary or something like that. They just want to Pahlavi as a leader for
change, for a transition.
For change, yeah, for regime change and something like that. At the outside of Iran, many people in Canada, Vancouver, Munich, and other cities say the same word. So we have to consider this situation.
Mm-hmm. So you say that the opposition is unified with Pahlavi? That would contradict what you just heard.
Yeah. Because we have to notice during the years, many years, left-wing and left parties and many reformists, Iranian reformists, promote the idea is really close to the Islamic Republic. But when you look inside Iran, you see many people stay together and live side by side, and they have no other option except Reza Pahlavi. You know, this is a kind of propaganda when people talk about Kurdish ethnics, Azerbaijani ethnics, Mujahideen Khalq, or something like that. Because people inside Iran just want things. Reza Pahlavi, justice.
Daniel, when we're in an international talk show, there's one aspect that I would like to touch on very briefly, if you can. What about the rest of the international community, apart from the United States? What do you make of what Germany or the European Union has provided in the last few weeks?
We have been rather passive, also overwhelmed by the situation. But regardless of if I agree with what Mahtab says about the popular support for Pahlavi or not, we have to realize that Iranians are a very important component of our society too. There is the Iranian diaspora is a huge potential. Now you have a lot of infighting a lot of now the Pahlavist movement, which tries to dominate the discourse. That's one thing. But the role of the Iranian diaspora in Europe, in the West, can be very important for a peaceful and democratic transformation in Iran. There is the scenario of a civil war. There's a lot of questions about how a transformation of the regime is possible. Is it a downfall of the regime? Is it going to be a Bonapartist solution with somebody from the generals taking the power? Is it going to be an external actor like the United States that are going to do a kinetic solution? But regardless, Iran has been a nation state for the last 300 to 400 years, which is a very rare example in the Middle East. And it has a long constitutional and even democratic tradition, of which the Pahlavi era is just one picture of a long movie. And we should bear this in mind and care about Iran and the situation of its people.
I have a last question, just yes or no. Will we see a U.S. military intervention in Iran?
Potentially.
You think? Yes. You?
I think I've already said my last word.
All right. Thank you very much to all three of you. And of course, to you for watching. Remember, you can always watch our shows on YouTube. Just search for DW News and the latest To The Point show. I'm Javier Arguedas. Till next time, take care and goodbye.